Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil karim. Dr. Hisham, distinguished friends, I'm of course delighted as always to be back here. My only concern is every time I get to the CPIT, when I went back, I go back to prison. But this time, alhamdulillah, I think we have made history. It's quite unprecedented that we could garner enough support among Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists in Malaysia to effect change. This is a period when racism seems to be on the increase here, and particularly so in Europe, where religious strife among Muslims, and in India, Muslims and Hindus is also on the rise. But I am, alhamdulillah, glad to say that Malaysia seems to be going against that trend. It's easier said than done, because racist appeal, racism, and religious bigotry can be very pronounced. And though there are elements that would continue to propagate such sentiments, but by and large, Malaysians were able to effect change through the ballot box without one life lost in the process. And we happen to be a majority Muslim country. So it's not only despair and gloom. There is also a possibility of change with yaqeen and with the mission, inshallah, and with the support of the people. I always say, I mean, here, my colleagues know, other than Hisham, Marhum, Jamal, Sheikh Taha, I always say, other than our faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is also in our faith in the values and the wisdom of our people. Wisdom of the masses. Now, wisdom, the belief in the masses has also been well formulated by a great Spanish thinker, Ortega y Gasset, in his Rebellion de las Masas, revolt of the masses, not the revolt in the revolution, but in terms of creating this awareness, which is very critical. Our problem and our challenge in discussing, for example, the issue of conscientious government or governance is because academics and elites think that they have all the answers. They formulate ideas that doesn't seem necessarily to connect with the aspirations of the masses. I was in African American History Museum yesterday. I deliberately chose to spend there a few hours. It is a remarkable and ingenious effort, and it is, to me, extremely effective in understanding the antecedents of history. You are aware of some of the literature on the subject, including Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent book, to understand, not only to be able to continue this rhetoric about racism and independence and liberty and democracy, but to understand the atrocities, the crime inflicted on a community, in this case, the blacks, which the attempts to defeat the entire dignity, confidence. Although we talk about liberty or democracy, this will not change and alter unless the entire psyche can be altered and changed. So we, as I see it, issue of governance, conscientious governance. Why, in simple terms, good governance? There's some very prominent academics here. That's why I choose some complicated terms to impress them. But but essentially, what I mean is what is in deficit. What is in deficit is not just democracy. It is good, responsible, transparent, accountable government, which Fukuyama, at least these days, talk about democratic accountability. We may disagree with Fukuyama in some areas, but on this issue of democratic accountability, I think he is right. It's just not democracy, but accountability associated with the entire transformation or change. Now, and this is not necessarily something new. It's not after the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. It is there, strongly embedded, as part of our religious, cultural tradition. But as always, whether in our understanding of the Quran, is not necessarily reflected in our actions. We talk about rahmatan lil alameen, but in the name of Islam, we can be racist and bigots, contradicting the essence and the values promoted by our own religion or religious values. I'm not here to concern about the design of the rest, American or European. I'm more concerned about the internal dynamics within Muslim societies. Why we are not able to surpass these old prejudices which our faith demand us to essentially change. Now, I said that this antecedents of history would suffice at least to give the fundamental principles and values. We talk about our understanding of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. When I grew up, Salahuddin was a great leader because he could defeat Richard the Lionheart and the Crusades. But we begin to learn, we appreciate the fact that it is more than that. His contribution is not just defeating the European power. His contribution is because he created a new culture, a culture of knowledge, culture of discipline, of values, of ethics in governance. And I was clearly, personally, at the personal level, was surprised that, I think the works of Ma'luf and some others too, that first 10 years, his concern was not extending territories or fighting the rest. His concern was to consolidate governance, consolidate what he has, making sure that most religious institutions, education institutions, become the place of learning, acquiring knowledge, and practicing the deen, and understanding the Islamic mission. In order to do that, he has to enhance trade relations, invest, invite Muslims, Christians, regardless. So he managed to work with Christian kingdoms or protectorate just to make sure that the country can propel economic growth. Because then both the educational institutions or social programs, and of course even the army at the time that Islam was under siege, could be managed. I think it is important for our scholars, for example, to attempt to introduce these great leaders in this context, not only as a great hero because of his ability to muster a major armed forces to defeat during the Crusaders, but to me, most significant is the first decade of governance, where governance and conscientious governance and to connect with the demands and aspirations of his own people is pertinent. Now, I was also I was made to be aware that this whole celebration of Maulid Rasul, which also happens to be a controversy now in Pakistan, when Imran Khan says he wants to make sure that Maulid Rasul becomes a national sort of program agenda. In Malaysia, we do celebrate Maulid Rasul. Because some, Wahhabi or Salafi say it is bid'ah, dalala, and bid'ah, dalala means nar is the place. I said, I'm sure Allah is more forgiving. He will not send me to hell just because I have Maulud. But what the legitimate criticism in this celebration of Prophet's birthday can be found if it is just a celebration of rituals. I remember one of the basic verses in the Quran in our initial trainings, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu istajibu lillahi walir rasul idha da'akum lima yuhyikum. Is always a reference to the rhetoric or the idea of da'wah and actualization in practice. Actualization is a favorite term used by Marhum Farouqi. Actualization of the ideal. But it is the amal. It's always da'wah wa amila salihan wa qala innani min al-muslimin. It's always reference to that. And that is terribly lacking. You go to all these so-called tazkirah in the mosque, including in Malaysia, oh my word. They have all the answers in the world. You talk about artificial intelligence or whatever. You ask any question of the war in Iraq or in Lebanon, they have all the answers in the world. You know why? Because they don't follow. They say, why is the problem there? Because we don't follow the Quran. Period. And so this simplistic sort of formulation is certainly not helpful, because you don't address. And we have to have the humility to acknowledge that there are limitations. We don't have all the answers. I preempt this because I anticipate Mama Said is going to be asking me some difficult questions, and I'm telling you that I don't have all the answers. And they say, what? You have a great experience. I say, I spend more time in jail than outside. And Hisham is a great friend, so he talks about all the ministerial positions that I've held. But he forgot to mention that I was 11 years in jail. The only advantage is I'm able to read all books possible. So Tipaiti and Jamal will make sure they get all the necessary titles. So, but it was that's why I know about Salahuddin, because Jamal was Kurdi. So very biased. Now, so my point is this, that the deficit is governance. People say, I'm always engaged in this battle with Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, the great brother, who says, it's education, brother. It's Islamic education. It's understanding. Yes, of course. But I said, without governance, who is going to disburse that education? Who is going to give this creative environment to allow you for a reasoned discourse that's essential in formulating ideas, a free flow of ideas and exchange? Therefore, all the limitations that you hear in the West, including the United States, is less than or minor compared to the limitations in Muslim countries and Muslim societies and developing economies. If we do not have this freedom and creative environment where creative thinking and creative thought is being encouraged. And we cannot have conscientious government without freedom, of course, but with good governance, you can therefore allow for this creative thinking and move. So I'm not saying that you discard all programs, including close down triple IT, and go back and start working for regime change. I do not promote this idea, but what I'm saying is that do not preclude this as one of the major issues that we have to contend with. Because I think who decides whether there's a creative thinking to be allowed in education institutions or not is the government. Who decides how much money is to be disbursed for education or public health? So whatever one may ideas or views or criticism against President Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, his success, to my mind, to a large extent, is to encourage to disburse huge sums for education, and one of the best public health programs in any Muslim country other than infrastructure. But that is due to government enterprise. And again, I said historical antecedents other than Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Of course, this classic letter from Khalif Ali bin Abi Talib radhiyallahu anh to the Egyptian governor Malik Ashtar, which I thought need to be republished with notes and references because the ethical dimension in terms of in governance is so compelling in this short treatise. I know people have written about it with annotations, but I think, given the present scenario and the challenges in the contemporary period, probably there's a new assignment for TPIT to relook at some of the classic texts on governance, and with a strong emphasis on integrity of leadership, because the failure of governance is because of the failure of leadership. Notwithstanding if there are, of course, outside forces, intrusion into the domestic affairs, but otherwise is the failure of leadership. And the short treatise in this letter is, of course, one of the most compelling case on governance and ethics ever written. Although we can bring Cicero and the rest of the classics, but this is important, and I think we need to relook at it. We tried, I remember one of the first things I did as a young minister in government is to persuade Dr. Mahathir, then the Prime Minister, to use this to encourage people to understand ethics, because otherwise we have to battle with the so-called Islamists who talks about application of the hudud. In the absence of education, understanding, awareness, or even ethics in governance, it's just hudud. You implement it, then you are Islamic because you follow the Quran. With an ethics part of the Quran or governance part of the Quran, that's of course not a priority as far as they are concerned, and I think it's still a major issue that we in the Muslim world have to face between good governance, conscientious governance, and applying strict, immediate application of Islamic laws. As I said, this is a major problem in the Muslim world. I remember Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, soon after we won the elections in Malaysia, managed to speak to me, rang me up. Technically, I was still in prison, was in hospital, but once we won, Then the prison staff immediately allowed me to speak. I had no access to telephones or radio or television or newspapers because I was solitary confinement. But there's a reality in politics. We won. So he said, but he said something very pertinent, my point here. Because he said, the last few years have been news of despair, and gloom, and frustration. But I have heard, after all these years, at least one glimmer of hope and a positive story from Malaysia, that we have this new wave of change, people supporting a demand for change. And we did it. But again, I say in humility, it is not easy because we have high expectations. People expect you to change, rid the country of corruption and the abuse of power, immediately have free media, judicial independence, and relieve some of the major economic hardships in the country. When the country is destroyed, when billions of dollars are being plundered, it's not easy to then affect change, because economic growth would require correct policies, and policy adjustments, new investments, before we could embark on some new initiatives. But inshallah, now Dr. Mahathir is back in power, supported by us, and I will, inshallah, assume that responsibility at the right time. Because there is also, because so many friends ask, are you sure, Anwar? Are you sure? I said, nobody is sure. It's فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَوَكِّلِينَ. That's the best, the answer. But then we have entered into this agreement, and I know everything is awfu bil uqud, so the agreement stands as it is, and inshallah it will prevail. Now let me also mention, other than this problem of good governance, is to deal with high expectations, is also to accept that the entire environment have changed. You know, once the media is free, a country has to grapple with a new entity. For example, it's easier to criticize leaders now, which was unheard of before. You can have the mainstream media questioning some of the Prime Minister's remarks. It's happening now. And some of our people are certainly not ready. How do you have a Prime Minister being criticized? As I used to say before, of course, if you do, in the past, you have freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom after speech. Everybody say, no, there's no freedom of speech in Egypt. I say, no, you're wrong. You have freedom of speech. But what happens afterwards, good luck to you. Now, so we have that issue. For example, do you then allow people to express their views on sexual orientation? I said, if this a new regime, you must allow them to express their views. Because we must have the confidence that we can counter these arguments in a reasoned discourse. Particularly in Malaysia, it's stronger because not only Muslims would want and believe in the sanctity of marriage between men and women, but the Christians, the Hindus, the Buddhists, by and large, would support that. But then to deny people from expressing their views will be difficult, because you come on a manifesto and a promise. You must allow people, even if you choose to disagree with them, based on Islam or constitutional guarantees and provisions, you must allow them to express their views. But we have to then navigate these new problems. Now, and then we have to deal with the mushrooming of civil society. My main concern or issue is this: like the great economists and planners, there's sometimes disconnect between the actual problems confronting our society and the more sophisticated understanding of Keynesian, post-Keynesian, GDP and investments, portfolio, etc. That's what their discourse is. But there is grinding poverty, the gross inequality in our midst, which must be addressed, which have to be addressed, which is of little concern of many of the civil society organizations. Because every group has their own priority or their own agenda. But to us, a major problem is a government, as you read, have you read in Malik Ashtar's account, the whole basis of governance and raison d'etre of a regime is to ensure that the demand of every single citizen must be met at our level best. There's no clearer example than Omar Abdul Aziz in this. In 2.5 years, to be able to deal with basic problems of poverty in the midst of plenty. So I think, not that I'm not people, some of my colleagues in the civil society question, look, Anwar, we were all there for you since 98. When you were in prison, we were there speaking for you. I say it's true. I accept their role. But I'm saying, let us re-look at the agenda, look at the priority. It's not just statistics and figures. Governments have a tendency to give statistics. We have been successful from 40% poverty to 15%. From gross inequality, Gini coefficient of certain percentage to less, or whatever, or public health, from 1 doctor to 10,000 people to 1 doctor to 600 people. Okay, impressive statistics. But if you happen to be in that 10% poverty, or you happen to be in the category they don't have access to medical help or facilities, or good quality education, then you have a problem. So I think the danger of statistics, even if they don't lie, because statistics do lie, as you know, even if they don't lie, rest in this issue of being cast aside, because you look at the rosy picture, which can be misleading. And I think I represent a different view. I said, as long as there is injustice to one person, it's the duty of government, of the rulers, to deal with it. And you cannot say, no, we have dealt with 70%, 30% they can wait for the next 10 years. What if that 30% happens to be your child? Would you say or give the same answer? I think this is an issue of dignity and integrity of our people. So I think that's, to my mind, sustainability. We talk about economic sustainability or social, but sustainability in the immediate and medium term would mean the rise, growth, economic and social of any country that would guarantee service, justice to its citizens. I would end by saying that, as I have already strongly encouraged CPIT as an institution to also focus on governance in the context of maqasid. Our traditional views have to change according to the dictates of the times. In Malaysia, I happen to have played a small role in encouraging the setting up of the Islamic banks. And we become quite rather successful compared to most countries. And when I became Minister of Finance, the moment I transferred our reserves from the conventional banks to the Islamic Bank, immediately the Islamic Bank grew as a major bank in the country. But now, as formulated by Najatullah Siddiqui himself in some of the recent articles. Najatullah Siddiqui, as you know, is the Indian economist who have been pushing for setting up Islamic banks since the 70s. Very effective and very influential. But in his recent writings, he has been most critical. This is rare for an academician. He said, not that I was wrong, but I think people don't build from my initial ideas other than introducing new instruments. What is new instruments? New instruments is what was being introduced by the conventional banks, that we Islamize it by making it halal, khalas. But making halal is certainly not part, it's only a small portion of part of Islamic economics. You see, it must be re-looked from the context of the maqasid. What are the higher objectives of the Sharia and of Islam? Is justice, is participation, is solving the basic problems of the economy. The Islamic banks finally have to be assessed from the profit of each bank. I must confess, I used to serve in the Barakah Bank for a long time. And this has been the major internal battle with the banking system. So that is why I think to rethink and relook, and this is the role of governance. The leadership has to provoke and push for reforms. Is islah mastata'. What is reform to the best of your ability in the Quranic term is in every field and every sphere, so that it comes back into the maqasid, which in terms of governance, which means to guarantee peace and security, and also socio-economic justice. And again, this is in Shatibi's Mawafaqat, in referring to the dialogue between Malik and his father, Umar Abdul Aziz. The priorities are laid down very clearly there. So may I again thank you for being patient enough. I've been patient for a long time in jail, so for exceeding 5 minutes, I can be excused. But thanking Hisham and colleagues at TPIT, and wish them well in this enterprise. But incidentally, this morning, before I reach here, I, of course, spent some time in the cemetery because to remember the great contribution of our teachers, brothers, including Sheikh Taha Jabir Al-Alawani, a great teacher to us, to me, my family, to many of us, and of course a great brother, Jamal Barzanji, and Jaglit and Mona Abu Fadl, and it gives me real pleasure. One of the things I thought I should do when I was in prison and hearing about the demise of these great brothers and sisters is to say that I must get back to the States, not to be honored or to be giving speeches, but at least to visit and recite some Quranic verses in remembrance of these great du'at thinkers. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.